Let me welcome Linus up here. And this guy is going to help you out with the thing. And so while we're getting Linus's microphone fixed, by the way, no slides, and definitely everybody get your phone switched off or on silent, and maybe I'm going to have to remember to do that in a minute myself. Just to get an idea of the demographics here, how many of you guys are students? Raise your hand, like hi. So, most of you. How many staff members, faculty members at Aalto? Okay, great. How many of you are developers in one way or the other? Excellent, all right, very good. And how many of you are either currently entrepreneurs, want to be entrepreneurs, or looking at that as a possible career? Okay, good. We're getting there. One other nice thing that I can't test like this, but I noticed looking at the sign-ups that almost exactly 50% of the audience does not have a Finnish last name. So Finnish or Swedish, so I assume both of those. So we have a very multinational crowd here, and I think it's going to make for a nice setup. So the general idea here would be I'm going to kick things off with a couple questions, and then I want to open it up very quickly to you guys, and really encourage you to come up with something interesting to ask. And I'm sure Linus will find something interesting to answer. I'll preempt him with one thing, by the way, is I think he'll tell you that he's not an entrepreneur.
Correct.
He's an engineer, and I think it's a really interesting. The whole history of Linux is really interesting as it relates not only to entrepreneurial stuff, but basically to getting things done and building something big with high ambition. So let me start off. I did a search on Google Video of Linus Torvalds, and I got 1.45 million hits. So I went and looked a few of those to figure out what are the questions that have been asked already, and what might still be left to ask. And I'm sure that I obviously don't hit all of it. Also uncovered a great page with Linus Torvalds quotes, which is a treasure trove of interesting stuff.
Okay.
Really recommend you guys to take a look at it.
I'm leaving now.
So I'll pinpoint it. No, I'm not going to pinpoint those, but I guess my idea, or the idea here, would be to try to talk about some things that are interesting from our kind of burgeoning developer hacker community here. That's also starting to look more and more at not necessarily going to big companies that may, for example, not be having as many jobs anymore. I don't know, I'm just guessing. But also for roles in any kind of enterprise and government even. So I think we really try to look at the idea of entrepreneurship as more deep down as something that's kind of driven from within, and it's more of a way of thinking. But I wanted to ask a little bit about the beginning of Linux. I mean, I know been asked about it many times before, but what kind of fascinated me is that you know, a multi-hundred billion dollar ecosystem was born basically in a bedroom in a probably cold, dark evening in Helsinki. Maybe an overstatement, yeah. But could in the question kind of is this: you've said often that it's a bit accidental that it became something so big. Yet we're of course as a community trying to encourage big thinking and ambition. So maybe could you just tell us a little bit about what was going on and what was kind of going through your head as you were kind of taking the first steps?
So as Will already mentioned, I really don't see myself as an entrepreneur. And I come from a background where even when I started Linux, I was 21 years old and I had basically programming half my life at that point. So I was in the situation where programming was a hobby, but it was almost a habit, that I had made some bad mistakes at times and bought some odd computers that were not very well supported. And as a result of that, I had gotten very used to the fact that you can't even buy ready-made programs. You have to write them yourself, because I started off with a VIC-20, which was actually fairly common, but it was common at the time when it was not common to really buy stuff for it. So I started programming, then I switched to a computer that was very much unsuccessful, the Sinclair QL, that had a very small community, and again, that meant that there was never even a question of running programs that other people wrote. If you didn't write your own programs, you didn't do anything with that computer, pretty much. So I had been constantly just doing programming all my life, and I was looking for a new project, and they all ended up being things I used myself, plus the occasional game that was so bad that I would never use it. So, but usually it was things like, I wrote my own assembler, I wrote my own editor, I wrote my own tool for doing this and that. And I came to Helsinki University, found out about Unix, and decided I want to have Unix at home. And how hard can it be? I mean, you really come from that like history of saying, hey, I always write my own tools. And I mean, I actually tried to find commercial tools again. And this time it was on a regular PC, so you actually would expect that by now, 91, you can actually finally, in my life, I wouldn't have to write my own tool because I could buy it. But it turns out I couldn't, because it was expensive as hell. And it was geared towards literally banks. I mean, if you looked at Unix on PCs back in the 90s, the main users were banking applications and things like that. And for some reason, when you sell into that market, you add 3 digits at the end of the number, just because banks is where the money is, obviously, right? So it was not geared towards my kind of use, where I wanted it for my own personal use. So it wasn't planned, and it was very much accidental, and it literally was a question of, hey, I've done my tools all my life. I'll do this too.
Interesting. What was the, can you identify the first point where you thought that there might be some level of commercial opportunity?
I can identify the first point where I said, what, they're selling that? Yes. It actually happened very early on. Like I remember, I think it was Byte magazine in like January 92 or something like that. I mean, this was really rough. This was Linux 0.12, and there was an ad for selling, what was the first? Was it SLS that was the first one or something, where they basically sold the service of, you could buy 7 high-density floppy disks, I think. And it was, I forget how much it was. And the only reason I actually know about this was, I didn't get that Byte myself, but Andrew Tannenbaum, who we've had a few small discussions before, he actually sent me the notice about this and asked me, was this really what you wanted to happen? And I was like, yes, and I don't know, because by then I had realized it wasn't really about the price, but that what I wanted to happen was easy availability of Unix, because that was what I had looked for and couldn't find. So in a sense, it was like, it was clear that Andrew Tannenbaum expected me to say no. I wanted it to be free on the internet, and these people who are selling it are evil, but I was actually, hey, it's convenient to buy it if you have the $35 or whatever it was. It was not a huge amount of money, but it wasn't like $5 either. You can buy it on the floppy and not wait for 7 days for it to download over a 300 baud modem or whatever. So.
How about early on? You know, you said you'd obviously been programming for some time, had some victories and some failures. I mean, can you identify the few kind of things you would have done differently very early, or and then the converse, mistakes that were made as you started, let's say, building it and extending it?
Really, the very early days, I have a hard time even imagining what I did that I could have done wrong. None of my programming career was really planned. It was a passion for me. I started programming when I was so young that I read all these books about assembly language without really noticing. So kind of a background, I did not understand that assembly language was supposed to be the symbolic form of machine code. So I always called what I wrote assembly language, even though what I actually wrote was the literal numbers. I wrote the machine code because I did not have an assembler. So to me, assembly language was the data statements that had the numbers in them. That's how I started doing assembly language. And anybody who actually knew what they were doing would have called that machine code and would have bought an assembler because they realized that's just stupid. But I didn't know what I was doing. So I literally, for several years, including my first few months with the Motorola 68K, I would do the assembly by hand and actually write machine code. And that was just because I didn't know what I was doing. Right? So.
How about then fast forward to the kind of Linux community starting to build, in terms of management of the community. I mean, I think this is I guess Linux is known to be the biggest collaborative effort of mankind. I've read I think Wired called it or something like that. But obviously the management, how did you get it going?
So I actually think building the pyramids took a lot more planning than Linux. Yeah. Because one of the things that I think is really interesting is how there was zero management, there was no logistics, there was no planning going on at any point, and what happened was through open source, people did what they were good at doing. So for example, I still don't maintain a website. I have never in my life done any web programming because I'm not interested. I think that kind of stuff is, you have MIS people to do that for you, right? I'm interested in programming. But there are people out there who they set up a website and do all the DNS magic, and they can do it in their sleep because, I mean, that's what they do. And they don't even think of it as their job. It's just that's something that they do on the side. And that's what happened when I put Linux out for FTP for the first time. I never figured out how to set up an FTP site, right? There was somebody who did it for me, so Ari Lemke. There was, when business started happening, I didn't get into this for the business side. I wanted to do, again, programming. So when other people started selling Linux, I was like, yes, now I can avoid caring about that side too. I got out of, for the very early versions, I had to do my own programs in user space just because, I mean, I was the only person there. So for the first couple of months, I would release not just my kernel sources, but I would also release 2 disk images. And 2 disk images, because the first disk image was the binary version of the kernel, just so you could write it to the boot floppy, and the other disk image contained your root file system. There was no init, init is too fancy. We only need a root shell, and that's it. That's how real men do things, right? And then somebody else came along and said, hey, this is stupid, you need to have init. And I was like, I do? And they just did it. And I stopped doing my disk images because, again, that was not what I was interested in. So the real power of open source, as far as I'm concerned, well, one of them, is that different people are good at different things, and different people have different interests. And what open source really allows is that you don't have to do the planning ahead of the logistics of setting up a company, and I realized this is about entrepreneurship, and you should set up a company, and you should know that you need an MIS person, and you need an executive assistant, and you need this and that, and you need to know how to balance the books. And as far as I'm concerned, the big advantage of open source is people do what they're good at, and they automatically gravitate towards that. If you're good at doing a website, you like doing that kind of things, you just do it. And that was very interesting, how there was no planning involved, because we didn't need to plan. It was all very organic. And that's actually how the development has worked too, that we have, I mean, we've had some situations, we've had the source control management issues, we've had that happen a few times where we had really painful problems with maintaining the source code and having to completely change how we did things. And then we really had to do that in a planned manner. I mean, those did not happen randomly. But those are actually very few. Most of what happened in Linux development was very natural. The hierarchy we use for doing development, the fact that I work with 10 maintainers, roughly, 10 or 20 maintainers who all have their own sub-areas, and they have their sub-maintainers that they work with and they trust, and they have their portion of their sub-areas, and we have this network. It wasn't like we designed that either. It's just happened because that's how people work. So a lot of Linux development has been very much an organic process.
Based on, I guess, trusting, two-way trust between the parties.
Yes, but on the other hand, a lot of this is stuff that I analyze later, saying, hey, that's how it works, and I'm wondering, why does it work that way? Yeah. But the fact is that is how people work, that the whole two-way trust between a small number of people. You trust your friends, you trust the people you work with for over time, and you don't trust 100 people. I would never trust this audience. I mean, you look like a shifty couple of guys and gals, right? You trust your close relatives. You trust 5, 10, 15 people. Even people who know a lot of people, even when you have like a huge network of people you rely on, maybe you're on LinkedIn and you have maxed out and you have 5,000 people in your network. How many of those do you trust? 10, right? And that's kind of a basic issue that the way people work is I think inherent in our brain. I mean, the 10 might be 5 for some people who are not that socially adept, and it might be 50 for some that are, but at the same time, the whole development process actually, I think, is again, it works really well, and I think one of the reasons it works really well is because it grew up. We didn't try to enforce a certain hierarchy on it. We used the hierarchy that just worked on its own, and that turns out to be the right hierarchy.
Okay. Yeah, maybe my last question, and then I'll turn it open to the audience. Obviously, a number of companies have been commercializing Linux, and so my question would be, are you kind of satisfied with that end of the way it's been commercialized? It's okay. It's
better than okay. I mean, it was something that we were nervous about in the beginning. I mean, no question that when people started, and when I say we, I mean we. I mean, by then it wasn't just me. It was these other engineers that had slowly started getting involved, that whenever it was, I mean, long before IBM said, we'll put $1 billion, we had the smaller companies, and people were worried that what would happen when commercial interests come in. And what happened was commercial interests suddenly want to sell Linux. So they want to do all the boring crap. They do Q&A. I mean, raise your hand if you want to do Q&A, right? Nah, there was a hand up there, but I think that was a joke, right? And yeah, and or doing the whole user interfaces and trying to make it user-friendly. That was not a high priority for the technical guys, especially early on. So the commercial interests actually forced Linux to become much more well-balanced than that. I mean, sure, we've had our clashes, but at the same time, without the commercial guys, Linux would never have gotten where it was, which is kind of sad looking at so many of the open source projects, especially at the time. I think that has changed, but especially at the time, a lot of the open source projects were very much anti-commercial. And there was a very strong, we need to keep this free and pure, and companies are evil inherently, and trying to sell it leads to bad problems. I think and hope that mentality is largely gone now, but it certainly was there early on.
Great. All right. So I want to open up for some questions here. So first one, spotted here. So you hold, and we have a couple, Crystal. Yep.
Hi, Kirill Shtemov. Linus, do you follow any development of any new programming languages? Do you see any language except C which is suitable for development of operating system?
So I have to say, I'm kind of old-fashioned, and I'm really interested. The reason I got into Linux or operating systems in the first place was I really love hardware. I love tinkering with hardware. Not in the sense that I'm a hardware person. Giving me a soldering iron is a bad idea. But I like interacting with hardware from a software perspective. And I have yet to see a language that comes even close to C in that respect. It's not just that C, you can use C to generate good code for hardware. It's that if you think like a computer, writing C actually makes sense. I mean, and I think the reason it works that way is the people who designed C designed it at a time when when compilers had to be simple and the language had to be kind of geared towards what the output was. So when I read C, I know what the assembly language will look like. And that is something I care about. I don't do a lot of programming myself anymore. I'm a technical lead person. I merge other people's code. But if you go and look in the Linux Git history and look at what I do, the last few months, the kind of code I've changed, I made sure our file and path lookup takes as few cache misses as possible. And all that code is C, but in order to really be able to, it's optimized at the level where I worry about single instructions kind of thing, and especially single cache misses. And I love doing that because it's completely, to some degree people say you should not micro-optimize. But if what you love is micro-optimization, that's what you should do. And we made sure our algorithms are good before we started the micro-optimization. So I'm very proud of the fact that we look up path names way faster than anybody else, I guarantee it, right? And we can do it in parallel on a 1,000 CPU machine with no contention. That is something that has happened in the last 18 months, and that is impressive. You don't know how impressive it is until you've worked with that code for, I thought we'd never get there, but we're there now. So that's the kind of thing that really excites me from a technical standpoint. But
next one back here.
Linus, I was about to ask my question already this morning, but didn't have a chance. The Linux operating system is a standard de facto for the service platforms, that's for sure. And even nowadays it's being used for some mobile devices and for many of network switches and so on, but it's never reached really an edge of being a competitor at the desktop level.
Right.
Why?
This is my personal failure point in Linux, that I started Linux as a desktop operating system, and it's the only area where Linux hasn't completely taken over. That just annoys the hell out of me. It's like, you said it has had some success in the mobile operating system. Google's last numbers were 900,000 new activations every day. That's not some success, right? Right? So the desktop is really hard, and I know why it's hard, and it's still annoying that the desktop is basically the last holdout. The reason the desktop is so hard to crack is most consumers do not want to install an operating system on their machine. And that's not desktop-centric. You don't want to install an operating system on your cell phone either, right? The reason Linux is successful on cell phones is not because you have 900,000 people downloading disk images and installing them on their cell phone every day. No, it's because it comes on the cell phone pre-installed. And that has never happened in the desktop market, and it's really hard to get it to happen. I mean, you get it, there have been companies that sell, like Dell, even in Finland, although I know they do it in the US, but I think they do it in Finland too, that especially if you're a big business and you want to run Linux, they will pre-install Linux on your desktop. But it's something where you have to specify that you want it, and they do it for a very limited portion of the machines they sell. So it's not something very common. And if you don't get the pre-installs, you're never going to get the desktop dominance. And will that ever happen? Right now, the biggest hope is projects like Google Chromebook. And I have a first-generation Chromebook, and the thing is slow and horrible. And when I get back home, I think I should have a second-generation Chromebook in the mail. Just because, for some odd reason, Google sends me these things. So I will see. I know the hardware is so much better, so I'm no longer worried about the slow part. But this is something where I don't think you hit it on the. I know you don't hit it on the first generation. I don't think you hit it on the second. On the third generation, maybe. On the fourth, fifth, that's when we start talking. If you look at Android, it wasn't Android 1.0 that took off. So I'm hopeful that on the desktop it will happen, but the only way it happens is if we have pre-installs, and it's not there today.
Okay, over here, and then up at the top, next.
So you said that you see yourself as a technical person.
Mm-hmm.
And as the Linux started growing, you must have had to deal with a lot of business-related things.
No.
You never did?
I never had to deal with a single business-related thing in Linux, ever. Seriously. I've had to deal with a lot of other things, but business-related things, I got queries, and I just said, I don't care. We had legal issues. The trademark issue was a huge waste of everybody's time and hugely pointless. We've had tons of these stupid things going on, but I don't think I've ever had a single business decision or business issue I had to get involved in.
One more thing, that when you were developing Linux, you were a developer and you started it as a project. But as the system grew, your perspective about the operating system also changed. So how do you think, like how long did it take for you to grow up as who you are now? And like what's the difference between that Linus and this Linus?
I'm the wrong person to ask, and the reason is I mean, it's happened gradually, and I don't notice the difference, right? You could probably ask somebody who has known me but not seen me day to day and say, okay, compared to the geeky kid who didn't really like to look people in the eye when he was 20 years old, what's the big difference?
Between him and the guy that sat next to the president last night?
Yeah.
That was fun.
So it was, I don't know. I mean, one of the things that still makes Linux interesting for me is, that technical challenges keep on changing. So we still do relevant technical work. I mean, there's no question about that. But part of it is my work has also changed. I don't do programming anymore. I have had to make things like Git and try to make process changes so that we scale better as a community. And these days, most of what I do is communication. I mean, what I do is I read email, I pull people's changes, or I tell people that, no, this is too ugly to live, please go away and never approach me ever again. So that's kind of what I do. And that has changed over time, and that has kept the whole thing interesting for me. And I think there's literally people involved in Linux development who I remember coming in maybe even late 91 and certainly early 92. So there are other peoples who have been involved with over 20 years. Not many, but.
Okay, back there and then to the front row here.
Hello, my name is Miguel. I run an open source
Can you speak a little louder?
I'm Miguel. I run an open source company based in Portugal. And I'm wondering about the state of patent wars around companies. If you are going to do Linux again, the kernel again, what license would you choose now?
The one choice I'm really still very, very happy about is the license choice. Now, admittedly, the GPL version 2 is not the original license. The original license was something I wrote, and it was like 3 lines of code, and it says, you may not charge money for it. If you make changes, you have to send them back to me. Maybe it was only 2 lines. I can't remember.
C1 and 2.
Yeah. So, but I'm completely convinced that GPL version 2 is the right license. And that doesn't mean that it's the perfect license. It's still legalese, and it's still there's gray areas in the license, and it could have been better. But I really very deeply agree with the things laid out in the GPL version 2, even though I then very deeply disagree with most of the stuff that comes out of Richard Stallman's mouth. So the two are not in any way, I mean, you don't have to agree with Richard Stallman to still like GPL version 2, right? So I would not change, I would not change the license, that's for sure. There might be other things I would do differently, but I can't think of them either.
Erika? Yeah.
Is it on? Do you think Linux is in good hands so that if you decide today not to touch the computer anymore, it would go on and on?
So, show of hands, how many of you are involved in an open source project that is not the kernel? Okay, a fair number. How many of you have a core team that is more than 10 people? There's maybe another tentative hand. The normal size for most open source projects are 3 people, roughly. I mean, there may be people here. I mean, there were a couple of hands that had more than 10 people. Maybe there would be some more that had more than 5. In the kernel, we have 50 people who are very, very core. Every single release, every 3 months, we have 1,000 people involved that send us patches. There's the kernel development community, and I do not know why, is the deepest development community in the open source area by far. I mean, by 2 orders of magnitude often. And if I disappeared tomorrow, there would be, we'd all have to raise the flag to half-mast, and it would be really sad, but nobody would even notice in the kernel community. Right? And not quite true, but there's a lot of people who,
The master, but the decision-making is between the 1,000 in
it's not that I make decisions, but quite frankly, most of the real work is done by many people. There's many layers of decisions even before most code ever reaches me. And there are at least 3 or 4 of the core developers that can take over my work and do take over my work when I go on vacations occasionally. Right? When I go away for a week, I don't even bother. I just let people know that, hey, please, we're not in the merge window. Just don't bother me too much because I'll I'll be away. But if I go away for 2 weeks, I tell people like Greg and David and Andrew and a couple of other people that, hey, I'm gone for 2 weeks, you're in charge. So I have at least 4 people who are like, they can do what I do. In fact, Greg largely does do what I do. And if you know who Greg is, you know who Greg is. If you don't care. So I'm not.
Good. Okay, there's one in the middle.
Hi. Although you said you're like really technical person and you're interested in programming and you're not interested in some of the stuffs like user interface and other stuffs, but whatever you say kind of influences quite a lot on all those fields. For instance, you said you didn't really like GNOME 3 interface and people are all going like, whoa, Linus says, GNOME 3 is crap and something like that. So how do you feel about your influence in those kind of fields that you're not interested in?
So sometimes I'm a bit upset that people take what I say a bit too seriously. And then 5 minutes later I said, screw that. I don't care, right? I like that people take me seriously, but at the same time, I refuse to then let that mean that I don't say what I mean. I mean, I've always wanted to be very honest in my statements. I use strong language on the internet to the point where some people feel offended, and that's their problem. I actually think that especially in a community like open source, other developers need to know how I feel about things. I'm impolite because I'm impolite. I mean, I'm not making excuses for that. But I also actually believe that when you work with a lot of people, it's better to be really open about your feelings so that you don't have people who, by mistake, misread you. I've had that happen. I have literally had developers who were working on things that I didn't really like, but I didn't shut down early enough. They worked on it for a long time. They felt that it was ready. They submitted it to me, and I said, no, this is horrible, because at that point I had to make a decision. And in at least one of those cases, I had some other friends basically email me later and saying the guy is suicidal. Right? I mean, and that's not my fault, but at the same time, if I'm open early on and saying, hey, this is going down a direction that I don't like, I think that's actually healthier for everybody involved instead of me stringing people along and trying to be polite. So partly it's my personality. I am blunt and I am from Finland and I tell people what I feel like, but partly it's actually a conscious choice to say, no, I'm not going to tone it down just because somebody might be hurt.
Thank you.
Interesting. Okay, over here.
Yeah. So many things happen. Linux was accidental. Git was accidental. What is
Git, actually, I'm proud of Git. I want to say this.
Yes, but it was accidental.
It was, the fact that I had to write Git was accidental, but Linux, the design came from a great mind, and that great mind was not mine. I mean, you have to give credit for the design of Linux to Kernighan and Ritchie and Thompson. I mean, there's a reason I like Unix and why I wanted to redo it. I do want to say that Git is a design that is mine and unique, and I'm proud of the fact that I can damn well also do good design from scratch. Okay,
Yeah.
now you can
So
go.
what's the latest accidental thing that you work on?
I may have to come back to that because I can't wait. Yeah. I mean, we've had a lot of stuff that was accidental. I mean, the fact that, for example, that we do fairly well in cell phones and that multi-core in cell phones is actually important now and we're really good at it was an accidental result of the fact that we happened to do supercomputers 10 years ago. So there's those kinds of accidents that happen that are accidents because different people work on different kind of projects, and it turns out that 5 years after the fact, there were actually things that connected them that nobody ever saw coming, right? And that's been a huge success of Linux, and I think that's interesting from a technical standpoint, how important it has been for Linux to actually have one single kernel for every single device out there. I don't think people, and I didn't actually think it would be possible, but if you look at every single other operating system out there ever, nobody has ever done that before. Look at Apple. They have separate operating systems for their low-end devices and their high-end devices. Look at Microsoft, same thing. They're claiming that they're trying to merge them in Windows 8. They're lying. They're not. They're full of shit. But Linux is, no, but, and it turns out we did it because I actually care about beauty, and it turns out it was nicer to do it the way Linux did it. And it's a unique thing in Linux, and it's a big strength, because it turns out there's often these kinds of accidental technical connections that people didn't believe in at the time, but then things changed, and now cell phones have the same issues that supercomputers have.
Yeah, this one over here.
Hi, I'm interested in the time that you spent at the university back in the early days. And I know that you were at least briefly a member of a research group, and I was wondering what kind of experience that was. And I know that you did some teaching assistancies, which turned out to be surprisingly beneficial in meeting your wife and so on. But
I was all over the map. I loved being at the university. I really liked the university for many reasons. Like, I assume most of you are technical people from, well, now Aalto University. So you think the university people are like these theoretical nerds that are useless for any real work. I loved the abstract side of the computer science at Helsinki University, which is very different from, I think, the computer science here at TKK or Aalto. I loved Spectrum. The only time I really was over here was when we were in the pink coveralls and ran around drinking beer. I was a TA at university. I did a stint for half a year or a year in the Henry Thetis research group. It was interesting, and it means that, yes, it took me like 9 years to get a master's degree, which...
You were pretty fast then.
Yeah, well, you're supposed to be faster. I will say that it wasn't quite 9 years, I think it was 8.5. One of the years was literally me forcing myself to write the thesis. I had everything ready, and I'm one of there's a lot of people like that. I know I've heard other people have exactly the same issue, that you have everything done, and the only thing you have left is the writing of your final thesis. And one of the impetus for actually moving to the US was when I got a job offer, I was saying, okay, this will finally force me to do my thesis, because I refused to leave that university half done. So I actually didn't get the papers from Helsinki University until after I already moved to the US, but I had finalized everything. I enjoyed the university life, and I did a lot of different things. And for those of you who are young enough to still be studying, hey, enjoy the hell out of that time, because it was some of my favorite time.
well, can I ask a continuation on that? Why didn't you follow the academic side any further?
Oh, it's easy. You noticed I had trouble writing my thesis? I loved being at the university, but I hate writing papers. I'm not actually bad at it. I think I am a reasonably good writer. I have a hard time getting started. When I write something, I want to have like a point to my writing. I want it to flow. And if I don't see exactly how I get from the beginning to the end and make it all make sense, I can't get started, or I have a very hard time getting started. And quite frankly, if you don't like writing papers, you should not stay at the university. And I mean, I realized that and said, it had been my, I used to think that I would be a scientist and stay at university. And I realized, no, I just don't like writing papers. I don't really like teaching. I have to go to the industry. And I loved going to a startup. So if any of you ever get the chance, startups that are early in their startup career, when they're still doing the early technical stuff and they do not see where it's going and everybody's really gung-ho, are absolutely a wonderful work experience. I was at Transmeta for 7 years, and 5 of those years were wonderful. And then when the IPO was getting closer, it suddenly changed from not being so much about the technology, and suddenly you had to worry about customers, and you had to worry about money and IPO issues, and suddenly it wasn't fun anymore. I stayed on for a while, and then I said, no, this is not what I signed up for.
Just a quick last question. Did you get any support for Linux from the university, and would you have liked some?
I did, and there's a Finnish saying, and I don't remember the saying, but there's a Finnish saying that you should not stand up because you get cut down. What's the saying?
I've never heard it.
Okay. I'm sure there is, because I've heard it, I've heard actual Finnish people ask me that, wasn't it uncomfortable to stand out? Didn't people try to put you down and try to make you part of the same gray mass as everybody else? And I had absolutely the reverse experience at Helsinki University. It wasn't like they were... There was not a lot of special support, but all the people were very happy about me running my experimental stuff on the university network. And they were really happy when we did as just an example, a small detail, when we did the 1.0 release in 94 or something, the university wanted to give us the big main auditorium at the computer science building. And everybody was really nice. And there was a lot of, the computer science department got an alpha-based machine because they realized I was porting Linux to the alpha, and they thought, this is an interesting project. There was actually a lot of support. That it wasn't like official support, but within the computer science department, I think people in general were really nice. And the whole, sure, it was odd. Everybody inside the university realized how odd it was that something practical came out of the computer science lab. But at the same time, it was like, that's cool. I didn't know we could do that. So it was fun. I really liked Helsinki University. I'm sure I would have liked TF too, but I had a great time at Helsinki University.
Great. Okay. I have a question over here. Juho? Oh, no, you haven't.
Okay. Short backstory on so to explain my question is I got myself 2 years ago a laptop that had 2 graphic cards. It had an Intel and an NVIDIA, and it had the famous Optimus chip that was difficult to operate from Linux. And I saw at the beginning, I was expecting to get support at some point, and it was kind of difficult at the beginning. And full support came something like a half a year ago with one project that's on GitHub that's working pretty nice. Mm-hmm. But what I saw that at some point I was kind of expecting that maybe NVIDIA would kind of chip in and do something for it. And they said flat out, no, we're not doing any support. And I was like, well, we're playing in the same sandbox. Why can't we be nice to each other? It's like things like this that we cannot have the hardware producers think about the other stuff as well. Yes. Because they're like hard set on that you cannot really cooperate with them on this. It's like what's your comment on this, that kind of situation? I would say
I know exactly what you're talking about, and I'm very happy to say that it's the exception rather than the rule. And I'm also happy to very publicly point out that NVIDIA has been one of the worst trouble spot we've had with hardware manufacturers. And that is really sad because NVIDIA tries to sell chips, a lot of chips into the Android market. And NVIDIA has been the single worst company we've ever dealt with. So NVIDIA, fuck you.
Making some friends there.
Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that other companies are perfect either. We have had companies that just don't care. We've had companies that felt that Linux wasn't a big enough market. We'd have situations like that. At the same time, there's a lot of companies that have been very helpful since very early days. And I think it's very sad when you sell hardware and you actually use Linux and you're being really difficult about it. And I really, yes, I'm sad when it happens. We can't do anything about it, but it's life. I wish everybody was as nice as I am. Which,
Okay.
So, all right, I want to bring up a kind of like an open source movement of a little bit different kind, and this comes up because of the university connection here, and that's kind of like open courseware. There are lots of like developments like, okay, MIT open courseware, and then the US company Coursera by some famous people that offer kind of like open classrooms for 100,000 people and so on. So do you care to take a guess how this market will, or this kind of open source work will go forward?
I have a really hard time really making any judgment, but I do think it's really interesting how it's not just Linux, but there's been other, like the openness of the Linux development model has clearly kind of made some people stand up and think, how can we use this in our area? And sometimes it's been in odd places, but I like, for example, the open coursework is wonderful. I love the discussion that a lot of scientists have about open publications, and that kind of thinking I think is very healthy, but I can't answer your question. I don't know how it's going to work out.
Okay, here,
Hey.
Hanna. Oh, no, you could
Is
go
this
first
on?
and then
Yeah.
Hanna. Yep.
In the 80s and 90s, most of the people who used computers, they had some kind of clue that what is the code, like what they're using, and also many of them were like making code themselves. But nowadays, like most of the people in Western world are using computers, but they don't have any clue that what is in the computer and what is the code. So what do you think that would be said in for children in elementary school that could make them think that they also can make their own tools?
Right.
Question.
So I'm of the opinion that one of the great strengths we have as humans, as a species, is how good we are at specializing. And if you think about all the progress we've largely made it because certain people specialize in certain things and can do it much more efficiently that way. And I absolutely think that is true when it comes to things like being very technical and doing programming at a low level. I do not believe in a world where every child should be taught to program. I just don't think that makes sense. That said, what I do think makes tons of sense is to make sure that every child who has the capacity to really be passionate about programming and be one of those people who can specialize in this, those people should be encouraged, and they should have the possibility of noticing that, hey, this is really good and this is really cool. So I love the projects like Raspberry Pi that make just cheap computers available, because if you have successful projects, I'm not saying Raspberry Pi is going to be successful. I love the concept of it, and let's see how it actually works out. But I think it's very important to have cheap throwaway, literally throwaway computers that allow people to tinker. And if that means that 99 of 100 Raspberry Pis will basically gather dust because nobody uses them, that's fine if one of them made somebody realize, hey, this is cool, and started programming. So that's kind of my opinion, that I don't think we should try to make everybody program, but we should try to make sure that everybody who has an aptitude for programming should have the ability to notice and be noticed.
Okay. Here.
Hey.
Yes.
Hanna from Aalto Center for Entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurs, they're always taught that they should have a vision for the business. So are you saying that you didn't have any vision for the Linux in the beginning, and do you have it now?
Where is that question coming from? I just feel very, oh, there, you were sitting down. So I tend to call myself an anti-visionary because to me, what is much more important than vision is execution. And I always quote Edison saying that genius is 99% perspiration and 1% inspiration. So you do need to have the inspiration, but in the end, lots of people have ideas. It's actually finishing them and overcoming all the problems you will hit that is the sign of somebody who has a passion and really takes it all the way. That said, I think I'm the kind of person who believes in hard work and attention to detail and just doing a lot of work. I think it's probably healthy to have a certain amount of vision too. I don't think in some cases, having vision may be what gets you past the problem. My argument has often been that if you look at the stars all the time, you will stumble over the pothole in the ground because you're not looking where you're walking. So just because I'm a pedestrian looking at the details kind of person, maybe those visionary people do something good too. I'm not going to argue too bad. I believe more in having passion. I think really caring about what you do is way more important than having this mental vision of this golden future that you want to reach.
Hi.
Yes.
Do you like to see Linux overtaking like Microsoft and Nintendo as a gaming platform? And do you expect that to happen soon?
So I have to admit, I don't game. I'd love for gaming platforms to be more open because gaming platforms tend to be the most closed pieces of technology you can find almost. And I think that's kind of sad because it means that they are designed to basically exclude people from trying things out. At the same time, I understand exactly why the companies are doing this whole razor blade, sell the razor for cheap and get the money through razor blades approach. I understand why they do it, so I'm not complaining too much. It would be lovely to see more open source gaming. And it is an area where people have, spent some time. And I used to believe that open source programs were all about technical things because that's what they used to be. You used to have open source compilers and editors and operating systems and like geeky technical things. And I used to think that's all we'll ever do because developers do technical things. I was wrong. There's tons of open source programs in other areas. I don't think there's a lot of open source good games. And part of that may be that games are a lot about content and you really maybe need a different mindset about that, but I don't know.
Okay, two more questions. One here. One here.
How do you see the future of open source and open innovation when we see a lot of startups coming up nowadays? How should startups approach the open source and open innovation movement?
So I think if you're a startup, what you should do about open source is take advantage of it. I mean, that's really, I mean, you need that. You, as a startup, you need every edge you can get. And one of the edges you have is you're small and nimble, and you can take open source and you can try to really tune it for whatever special niche you're aiming for. And I think startups especially, and new, really oddball technologies that you're trying to drive that nobody has done before, that's when you should take advantage of open source and say, hey, we can build upon this base that is boring and does all these things that everybody has already done, and we'll add our special magic sauce on top and really take advantage of the open source model. And I think people do that, but I think they should maybe do it more consciously sometimes.
Okay, last one. Yep.
Hello, everybody. I'm Juha. You don't know where I'm from, but I know where you are. So I have a question for the audience. How many of you were part of the big Maemo MeGo adventure? Hands up.
Oh, wow.
So not all of us are born evil, but I have to confess that now I joined the ranks of NVIDIA. We're now upstreaming Tegra support anyway, just to make you happy. Even though you gave me the finger, I still thank you.
Okay, very good.
I like being outrageous at times. It's amusing to see. I guarantee you, if you make that video available on the internet, there will be thousands of people who are really upset. And and offended. I like offending people because I think people who get offended should be offended. It's like, it's kind of
good. All right. Okay. Great. Okay, we need to cut it here. So, wow, fantastic stuff. Really appreciate all of you guys coming here. I want to give a couple thank yous. Absolutely, first to Technology Academy of Finland, Aino-Maija Harla, for helping us get Linus here to do this great thing. Second thing is I want to thank also the Aalto Entrepreneurship Society and the Summer Startups Gang for helping here. Everybody here who has interest in building something of your own, you should look into the events of Aalto Entrepreneurship Society and the things going on at the Aalto Venture Garage. So let's give those guys a big hand. And last, we have a small prize award, another, not quite as big as the Millennium Prize, but we actually have another fantastic organic movement that actually started from Aalto.
Aren't you supposed
so I'll let
to throw those at me?
Present.
Probably.
Yes.
And since you don't really play games, it's maybe for your daughters.
I really need 3 of these then.
Okay. We'll get those. Yeah. Rovio's a great partner to everything going on at Aalto right now, so thanks a lot. And as I told Linus before, we're happy to ship these things to your place.
This is a bit bigger than I expected.
Good. But, and then, of course, last, Linus, thanks for spending your time here. I know it's been a wild week, but hopefully this has been a good way to cap it off.
Yeah, no, I enjoy doing the question and answer sessions, so getting a bit more like feedback is always funny. I hope you enjoyed it too.
Good. All right, thanks. Am I missing anything? So if you don't mind, outside, and then you're